guys, we're rolling, right? So we should just start talking.
You're
Stop talking and start talking.
So yeah, go for it.
Oh, really? Okay.
Well, we did all meet around Danger, right?
Yes.
But I don't know that you and I ever met during the Danger.
No, we didn't. We met when we came together to form Android in the sense that we went forward with the cellular version of it.
Right.
But we all had triangulated on Danger.
So Danger was a company that was started in late 1999, before there was any cellular data. Everything was 1G in 1999, and Danger started out as a company that was building a little data device, and then morphed into the opportunity of kind of the first 2G data device. It was a startup company, venture funded, and Rich was one of the investors.
I was.
And that was at...
For Orange Ventures.
Yep, Orange
My
Ventures.
first gig as a VC.
Yeah, and Orange was a global carrier at the time.
Yep.
And the first customer was T-Mobile US. At that point, it was VoiceStream before Deutsche Telekom bought them. And Nick was the product guy at VoiceStream.
Yeah, I met Andy at CES in 2001, I believe. So T-Mobile was in a unique position in the US market where we were the only carrier who was using GSM. And so we had GPRS, which gave us packet data. And that was the first real data network that could deliver good user experience with data. But all we had were phones. And so we had a 1-year kind of head start to have this US data network. And our job was to go out and find alternative devices that would bring data to life. And we didn't want the traditional form factor. We were looking for people who were innovating and were bringing out alternative form factors. And none of the big manufacturers were doing that. Nokia had done it in Europe, but they weren't willing to bring any of their data devices to the US because they had not been successful in Europe. And so we were out shopping, and all of our big manufacturers had nothing. And one of the engineers, Mitch Lustig, said, "There's this guy, Andy Rubin, you should meet." And so we met across the street at this little hotel, and I sit down with Andy, and he doesn't even have a form factor. He's just got a board on a piece of wood, mounted on a piece of wood, and he's got a picture of what the flip top eventually became. And that was the first time I met Andy. And he had this Apple background, and it was such an interesting device. I hadn't seen anything like this yet. And I remember telling Andy, because we were talking about what the price point would be. And at that point, people were talking about $400 or $500. And Andy was talking about a $199 price point, because the engineering that we were putting into this device was really trying to make it economical and cost effective. He was the only person who was totally focused on a consumer price point and a consumer user experience. And I remember telling him, well, you're either a genius or you're blowing smoke up my ass, and we're going to find out which one it is.
And we did. You sparked a couple of good memories there, Nick.
Yeah.
I think we came after the wood prototype days. You already had a
I
swiveling
remember
device when we
the wood
invested.
board. We had a name for it. I can't remember the name though, but we had like 4 of those. And this was at a time when the thing had a 27 megahertz ARM7 processor, and you had to do everything on a little 27 megahertz processor. And so the team, we could have probably put a faster, better processor in it, but it would have blown that cost, that $199 cost. So we went with a very lightweight processor, and I had co-founders Matt Hershenson and Joe Britt. Joe in particular was a big fan of the Nintendo Game Boy. So a lot of the hip-tops architecture took after the Nintendo Game Boy, and we know that the Game Boy sold for very, very cheap. They made it just enough to get over that price barrier so it could be a mass market product. But we had to build everything. I mean, nothing existed. You couldn't buy or license any technology for 2.5G at that time. And I remember with the VoiceStream partnership, the first thing you guys did is you installed a 2.5G cell site in our office building. And I remember people from Palm parked in their cars outside our office trying to get their devices to work on the cell site that you gave us. So it was definitely a race, as you put it.
Yeah. So right. So Andy. So at Danger, Andy created this very innovative mobile data device, and Nick and I were both at carriers with different roles. I was looking for innovative wireless devices to invest in, and Nick was looking at wireless data devices to launch. And then, of course, eventually we would want to take that device, introduce it to our operational team at Orange, and have them also launch it. But clearly Andy stood out and his team stood out, and that's certainly why we wrote the check and invested. And I think that's probably why Nick convinced his folks at VoiceStream to want to launch the device.
And then Danger ran its natural course. It grew up. It had a big carrier partner. It had launches. We had the smallest line at retail stores for 5 hours or something. And then we brought in an executive team, and I rolled off and started thinking about what my next startup would be. I am a technologist. I like building things. I build a bunch of stuff. You should see my garage. And a lot of it is just for sport, I would say. But every now and then something will make it to market. I think technology can make the world a better place still. And after Danger, I wanted to continue that, exploring that. So I got a little office in Palo Alto. No idea what I wanted to do, but I knew that office would be where the next idea happened. And then started assembling a team. And one of the first people I called was a gentleman named Chris White, who I had worked with previously at Web TV and had a great experience. He was a user interface designer, but more than a user interface designer, he was like a product designer. He was involved early on in the General Magic experience. He built an app called Streetlight, which, as far as I can tell, was the first mapping experience. It was Google Maps back in 1990, and he built that and just blew people away. So we brought him on as a co-founder, and Chris and I and one engineer named Brian Swetlin spent. We'll get to Brian, I think, in a couple of minutes. Spent a lot of nights just dreaming of what this company that we were forming would be. I had a domain name, Android.com, literally lying around. And so we kind of built the company around that domain name and called it Android, and went to business, trying to figure out what it was going to be. And I think there were, I have a drawer full of these relics of kind of the, it starts with a piece of wax that you carve to see what it could be. And the first thing that we did was we started exploring what it would be like to take a digital camera and build an operating system for it. An operating system that would allow the digital camera to run apps. Having just come off of Danger, I was a little
already done phones, been there, done that.
Yeah, a little shell shocked from doing phones, and thought we did a pretty good job at Danger. And I also had an investor that was also an investor in Danger, so we didn't want to kind of cross the beams and go do the same thing. So we started with cameras, and we built something. We built a prototype. You add a GPS to a camera, you add a big screen to the camera and an operating system, and you have what looks like a smartphone that you can do all sorts of cool apps with around location and crowdsourcing and face recognition. That was one of our first demos. Take a picture of somebody and immediately recognize who they were. And this was in 2004 or something, 2003 or 2004. The presentation was all about cameras, and we were looking at the graph of how many cameras were sold every year, and in 2004, the numbers weren't going up, the numbers were going down. And the reason numbers were going down is people were building cameras into phones, feature phones and smartphones. So we started looking at that and building a business off of a graph that kind of looks like that as far as volume goes. You either have to have a lot of confidence that your product will make it do that, or you have to change your mind and explore other opportunities. So I think that's the point where you and I had a coffee.
Yeah, it was First, it was a phone call in October of 2004. I call Andy. He had left Danger, and I wanted to see what he was up to. And one of the things that I felt like had happened with Danger was that it never realized its full potential. It was the most iconic consumer device in the US. It had sold hundreds of thousands of devices. Stars were carrying it around. It was featured they did a top 10 videos of Sidekick on the Black Entertainment Network. So this was the most consumer iconic device that had been done, but it was never as popular it never had reached the numbers of BlackBerry. And so I felt like we hadn't really finished our business of creating a device that we could use across all manufacturers, have one great user experience, and just have the best phone that we were trying to do. And we had done a lot. We had done quite a bit. We had done almost all of it. And so my question for Andy was, I want to go build the best phone the phone that we never got to completely finish while we were working on the Sidekick. He had left prematurely to us achieving that. And he told me that he was, so it was actually the second conversation. In the first conversation, you were shopping the cameras around with VCs, and I said, well, I don't know diddly about cameras. If you change your mind and you end up doing phones, call me back. And the phone rang a month later, and Andy said, I think we're going to turn our business, our first market towards phones. And that's when we met and started talking about business models and how we could move forward with Android.
Right, and in between there is when I sort of came into the picture because I started. I forget why we reconnected, but I had been at Orange with the VC hat on and an operational hat on, and I had just launched with my operational hat on, helped launch the first Windows mobile phone, and it was buggy and there were lots of problems with it, but I could see enough promise in the APIs that they had and the app environment that they had that it was Microsoft, combined with enough arrogance in how they were talking about, like, we were the only carrier launching that device, and we asked them to make changes, and they were like, no, we're Microsoft, we're not making any changes. We're the only carrier launching the first Windows mobile phone. And so my big worry was, is Microsoft going to control this platform? Like the mobile platform, which looked like it was going to be in a lot of people's pockets and be able to effectively be a computer in your pocket, is Microsoft going to control like they did the PC and other platform? And then with my VC hat on, we had invested in a company called Savage, which wanted to build an open Java-based mobile phone platform, and they just executed horribly. Like they had Orange invested, Vodafone invested, DT invested, and they still couldn't do the right things to get that to happen. So when Andy and I started talking, and it's like, oh yeah, it's not about cameras, it's about phones. That's when I think that's when the three of us started talking and said, how do you make a business out of this? How do we prototype something to bring to Mobile World Congress to show some handset manufacturers?
And so that was the genesis of kind of the team. And by the way, that all happened in a span of
2 months. By December, Rich and I were working on business models that we were then coming back to you with and saying, here's how we might shop this to carriers. And so literally in the span of 1 month, it all just came together, and all four of us were working on an open source platform that would be carrier friendly and still be able to go across all manufacturers.
Yeah, because Nick and I had that same experience where to launch a phone in the carrier, you were handing to the hardware manufacturers these big specs that said, build a camera to this spec, and then you would have to fight with them to get the look and feel you wanted. And we were like, well, if it was open, then the carrier themselves could implement their own experience on top of that platform.
And not having a cross-manufacturer horizontal platform, the manufacturers would say, sure, we can make a modification, but you're going to have to commit to 1 million units. The only kind of device in those days that were selling at a price point that would deliver 1 million units was the absolute bottom of the line free phone And so carriers were reluctant to step up to a $300, a $400, a $500 device and say, I'll give you a million units so that you'll make these changes for me that I only get to use on one manufactured device. And then I get to keep it for how long before I lose my exclusivity?
That's why the Nokia thing didn't work out.
Exactly.
That's exactly why the Nokia thing didn't work out. But what's really interesting, if you listen to the passion that's in this team for basically, enabling consumers, giving consumers a new experience that we know they want, right? The internet's kind of a thing back then. We know they want to take it with them, but there were all these blockades in the way, right? So if you look at how the team kind of filleted the fish and, really, covered all the bases. One was, the cost point, making sure that you didn't have to pay. I think the licensing fee for Windows was like $100 a device, right? Where you didn't have to pay like somebody's $100 for software on the device. And then on the other side, where the carrier, right, had a business opportunity, right? They would have a little bit of control. They could put the user experience. They could differentiate from everybody else and build a business around it. So all these pieces kind of fell into place where there was a part of the business that sold management systems to the operator, and that's the primary way the original Android pitch deck made its revenue. And then there was the open source operating system, right, which was Rich's thing. It was about ease of distribution, because we knew we were a startup company. We didn't have like a skyscraper full of biz dev people to go hunt down manufacturers and say, use our operating system. When you open source it and make it free, and if it's good enough, everybody starts using it, and it percolates up to the CEOs, probably from the engineer in the basement, because it made his job easier, right? So all that kind of happening at the same time, I mean, it was fun. It was fun having these strategy discussions, and it was like we were finishing each other's sentences.
Yeah, no, we were definitely in sync, and then codifying all that into the VC pitch, right? And that was, so it was about, well, we're going to get adoption because unlike these other handset OSs, this one's going to be great and it's going to be free. So the OEMs are going to be, great software that we don't have to pay a licensing fee for, great. And then having been, Nick and I being on the carrier side, giving carriers a way to have a service platform that we would make money from. So the idea was, in the VC pitching days, that we were going to sell carriers a platform that connected to the device really well and would let the carrier have photo album in the cloud, contact, Rolodex in the cloud, and other services, provisioning, ringtones. And so that was how the carrier was going to be able to monetize and make money from this, otherwise free OS. And then also the carrier benefited because instead of having to separately customize devices from 5 different OEMs different ways, the 5 devices from 5 OEMs would have the same OS. So it would be one customization experience.
And then something really big happened right after we started our combined version of what Android became in December. There was a phone call that Andy got from Larry Page.
Yeah. And this is at the point where it was the 4 founders, Chris, Nick, Rich, and I, and we had 4 other employees. One of them, my Tracy Cole, my admin from Danger. So there was, we were small. And Larry called me up, and I had met Larry probably a year and a half earlier. So he was a technology pioneer at the World Economic Forum. And with my work at Danger, I was the technology pioneer for the preceding year. So there was a mixer where I had met Larry, and there was a kind of passing of the baton. I gave a Stanford talk at about the same time for an entrepreneurial class, and Larry was in the audience. And this was at the tail end of Danger. I remember distinctly, we had an internet device. The Sidekick was the first always-on internet device, and we had a search engine on it. And our engineers all used Google. It's what everybody used back then. So they pointed the search engine for this device to Google without telling anybody at Google or without asking permission or without, negotiating any kind of deal, because it was great. That's what the engineers did. And when, Larry recognized that, from the audience, and then kind of circled around after he heard I left Danger, and basically called to see what's up, see what we were working on. Do you remember some of the first meetings?
I remember the first meeting that January in 2005, and it was I think kind of a short notice, and so you and I attended that very first meeting by ourselves, and yeah, I remember that meeting. It was quite fascinating. It was with Larry. Sergey came in at the end, and a fellow named George.
Yep, George Herrick.
Yep. It was very low key. They were very kept their cards pretty close to the vest, and they really wanted to just talk about creating a phone that would be a great experience. Larry basically started the meeting by saying, "I think that the Sidekick, the Danger Hip Top, is the best consumer device and the best user experience that's ever been created in the industry." It just kind of progressed from there. Andy might not agree with the next part I'm about to say, but it kind of turned into a geek fest where Sergey, who can be very technical, started to really drill down on a lot of the things that the Sidekick they had done, multitasking and different things, and started kind of challenging Andy and kind of putting him through the some hard questions, which he had lots of answers to. And at some point in the meeting, Larry said, "Okay, let's kind of come back to the bigger picture of we're here to kind of talk about, where this is going and not the technical details." And it was really just a very friendly meeting. And at the end, they basically said, "We're interested in helping you guys in any way we can." And they just kept it very casual.
Yeah.
And remember, we were pitching VCs this idea of a tiny startup building a new mobile phone platform.
Taking on Microsoft.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. And I, of course, when I was a VC, I always said, "Oh, I never believed a pitch that said Microsoft. It's a startup's going to compete with Microsoft." And of course, here we were, a startup that said we were going to compete with Microsoft. But one thing we thought that would help validate, because carriers, I think, were perceived by VC as these big, slow companies. And so we had this idea, maybe in part from the conversation you guys had already had with Google of, well, if we can get Google or Yahoo or one of these big internet providers to say, "Oh, if you guys build a phone, we would love to have a Google or Yahoo branded version of the phone." And we thought, oh, VCs will like hearing that. So the thought was to start having some BD conversations specifically where we would go in and make a little mock version of our candy bar Linux, booting phone that looked like it was branded Google or Yahoo and have a BD conversation. And so that's probably how I suspect you, with your knowing Megan Smith, had reached out, because I think we also then started to have some BD conversations, basically to ask the question so we could sort of record it for the VCs. If we build this platform, would you guys like to have a branded version of it?
Yeah. And that made it into the investor deck. There are slides on the investor deck that show gaps in the market that were about to be filled by Microsoft. Right, and that was kind of the area that we were going to attack, and that, remember, a pretty short period of time from pivoting from the camera to the smartphone, but also in that short period of time, we were in conversations with Google, and we were also raising money to be an independent startup. One of the virtues of an entrepreneur is you hedge 1,000 different ways, and that's what we all did. And I think Rich worked his network. Just so you all know, Rich lives on the East Coast. So we were a geographically dispersed team at the time. And I think you found some folks.
Yeah, a couple of VCs. Well, so Andy had gone up and down Sand Hill Road with Android as a camera OS. And so when he started to go back to them and say, no, it's a phone OS, it was a little hard to get the room full for the pitches. And the East Coast VCs didn't go to the West Coast back then as much. So I had some VCs that Andy hadn't pitched yet. And one of them was Charles River Ventures. We ended up getting a term sheet from them. And then, not on the East Coast, but from my other connections, I'd known Craig McCaw and Rob McCaley from Eagle River. And they also put a term sheet in, which we actually ended up signing, but with a carve out, because we'd already started having the discussions with Google.
And those discussions progressed. to the point where
Very quickly.
Yeah, pretty quickly.
But I think my remembering, because in that deck, one of the slides that we had basically said there's 800 million phones sold every year. Those phones are basically small computers you can put in your pocket. And if there isn't some open, strong alternative, Microsoft, just like they did with the desktop PC, is going to own a lot of those 800,000 phones. And this was back at a time when Google was investing a lot in Firefox because they didn't like the fact that Microsoft owned the browser platform. Yep. And if I recall, Larry was in the back of the room at that meeting, and I suspect he connected the dots and said, boy, that would be really bad, if that happened, or, don't you think you guys are going to need some serious help, which was code for acquisition discussions.
Yeah. And then, meanwhile, we had a technical team forming. We did some good hiring early on. A lot of the original architects and designers of the Danger hip-top came over. And we went to HTC, my friend Peter Chow, and we got basically a reference design from him, a device. It's a Windows device he was about to ship, and he gave us enough where we could give one to every engineer. And they, carved off Windows and inserted the OS that we were building based on Linux. And we had demos that were kind of limping along, and that was really the Sergey conversation. How are you doing this? How are you doing that? Mm-hmm. But at this point, it looked like a Windows phone running a different operating system, and that's what we were all working on. And I think the acquisition closed in July of 2005
Yes.
July 11th.
You guys are much better than I am with your
dates.
dates.
My daughter was born a few days later, July 16th.
And we all of a sudden we found ourselves 8 of us being Google employees, and set up in Building 44 with basically a charter to continue the plan.
Yes, and the only one detail I want to add prior to the starting at Google was when Google brought we had a follow-up meeting. All 4 of us went in there, and they basically put their cards on the table because up until this point, we didn't know if they were friend or foe. They seemed like nice people. They were so understated. We were like, are they trying to spy on us? Are they friend or are they foe? And so, we went there to give them an update. They kept this curiosity thing going. And we show up to do a demo. Chris White was there to show a demo, and they had a room full of people, and their biz dev people were there. Yeah. And they basically interrupted the demo and said, let us just say something. We just want to buy you guys, right? We just want to buy you. And they didn't stop there. They had a pitch, and here was their pitch, because it was brilliant in its simplicity and its impact on the future of what Android would become. They said, without us, you've got to sell this to the carriers. You're going to have to be beholden to VCs. If you come to Google, we make this free. So this business model that you guys got to go collect money from the VCs, all that goes away. Free. You basically have to sell free. In fact, it's better than free because we have advertising revenue, and we could share some of the advertising revenue from search with our carrier partners. And for guys like Rich and I mean, our eyes were like moons, right? Because all of a sudden you're like, this is the walking into a carrier and saying, instead of you paying us 25 cents per subscriber, it's at least free, and maybe you make money off of the usage of the customer. So this was like a marketer's dream and a business person's dream, and that totally changed our business model in a significant way.
Yeah, it did. I mean, but we shouldn't just brush over the negotiations, because it wasn't a slam dunk, no. Right? There were some, in February, I remember, because it was the last time my wife was going to be able to fly before having our daughter, and we were in the BVI on a boat sailing. And I had to have I had to look ahead and make sure the boat was going to be anchored somewhere where I had cell service, because I was calling into the phone negotiations. And I specifically remember the one where Andy walked away from the table. And Nick and I were like, okay, I guess we're done. We're not going to sell to Google. And we did go back to the table, and it was probably a good negotiating strategy to do that. But it was definitely not a slam dunk that it was going to happen.
No, it wasn't a match made in heaven from... Yeah. It all just came together serendipitously, but the way it changed our business model was pretty significant to our future.
Yeah, I mean, I've said it before, but I don't think Android would have been successful if it remained an independent company. Right? We needed a Google.
It would have been one of 4 Linux startup companies, right?
I don't, and I'll not only that, but I don't know that if we'd gone the VC route, that open source would have survived, because there would have been some trade-off down the road of, look, we have to make money, and I don't know the number. You guys might have a better idea, but let's just say somewhere between $250 million or up to $1 billion, Google put in resources into this platform over its life and then gave it away to the world. And what VC would ever do that?
Right.
They had a business model in search that allowed them to do something that nobody else could do. Plus, if you're a marketer and you're saying, the person that I want as my partner to launch an internet device to try to be the end game in internet, well, there is no better brand in the internet than Google. So they were a double win in that regard.
And kind of one by one, we took the services that we were hosting in our business strategy and moved them to Google services. So, the Sidekick was the first phone with an app store. Obviously Android in the early days had an app store. So we basically moved those into Google services. Gmail, Maps, YouTube, all the things that you find on your cell phone today, those became the Android services. And in fact, after we arrived at Google, the first thing the engineering team did at Android was basically proxy all the Google services onto the device. Those services at that time were HTML services, right? There was no conduit into an operating system. And that's one of the first things the Android team did.
Because when we got acquired by Google, and I just don't think people really realize this, the Apple hadn't even started its iPhone project. There just weren't smartphones, right? There was maybe the Sony Ericsson had the P900, which was the closest thing to a smartphone. So there wasn't even a smartphone category. And in Google, we were considered this wacky 10% of ever turning into anything real sort of project. There were no mobile services yet, right? The state of the art was WAP, right? Mobile web, and Google's mobile team was the team building WAP search. Like that was the state of the art. And so we were off on the side literally for a couple of years.
We were a skunkworks project.
Building this thing with our own BD, our own, sort of just off in a separate building, starting to build Android. I think Google felt very happy when finally there was an iPhone that they had Android. But yeah, leading up to that, we had to figure out, well, let's build the OS, and then we had to start figuring out what's the form factor for our first phones.
Yeah, it was an interesting time because technology was converging, and every now and then you have these moments in history where you have a processor that becomes powerful enough, memory becomes cheap enough, and at that moment, Synaptics and some of the other companies were building capacitive touchscreens, and that was an enabler for a completely fluid user experience. And I remember the first phone, we used to buy every phone that came to market that even showed any sense of innovation. And we bought an LG Prada phone. And it was the first phone that ever shipped with a capacitive touchscreen before the iPhone. The software guys hadn't figured out, it ran Flash or something, but they hadn't figured out how to do anything other than button taps, except for one app. There was one app on the phone that used gestures, and that was the clock had a globe. And you could spin the globe, and it had momentum, and you could spin the earth. And that was the first app that I had ever seen that created a user experience for capacitive touch. And it was amazing. And we started negotiating with Synaptics. We knew we were working on 2 devices at the time. Yep. And we knew one of the devices, our holy grail device, was going to have a Synaptics capacitive touchscreen on it.
Yeah, well, and those 2 devices, that was our dream phone called Dream. And then we had another phone which looked more classically like a BlackBerry, had a physical keyboard and a smaller screen above the keyboard, and we called that one Sooner, because the idea was, well, we can go to market sooner with that device, and then we'll develop both of these in parallel. And of course, I think we weren't completely bought in that the capacitive touchscreen could do everything, so we thought, well, it should have a keyboard hidden in there somewhere. And so Andy did some magic with a mechanical engineer to figure out yet another interesting way to hide a keyboard, to have it appear with a sliding screen.
And Dream turned into the T-Mobile G1.
Yep.
And it, I think when we made the go, no-go decision on which one of these two devices to launch, we were obviously influenced by, what the competitors were doing, and the iPhone launched. So at that point, we're like, okay, sooner, we could have done sooner, but let's double down on Dream because it looks like the specs are more comparable to what just launched by Apple. I think the other thing, and you probably have a good recollection of this, when the iPhone announcement happened, we hadn't announced our stuff. We were still the Skunkworks project within Google. There were a couple of conversations we had with other OEMs in the industry, and Samsung was one of them. And I think at that moment, maybe even a little before, we can go back in time a little bit, but at that moment, I think when the iPhone launched, the rest of the industry was trying to figure out what to do. And a lot of the industry turned to Google. The combination of Google services in a mobile environment with this modern operating system with a capacitive touchscreen made sense to everybody as the quickest path to formulate an answer.
Yeah, and well, when we had said to ourselves, well, how are we going to get this phone to launch and have a lot of support and have a big bang at launch? And one of our thoughts was, let's build a group of people, which ended up being labeled as the Open Handset Alliance, and let's get a bunch of hardware OEMs, let's get the software providers that have helped given us some of the bits to supply the software, let's get some carriers so that when we do launch, we have what looks like broad industry support. And I think we had close to 45 partners.
Semiconductor companies, we wrote the first drivers for Qualcomm and whatnot.
Yeah, so I want to add one perspective, having always been on the carrier side until I switched teams. And the entire time I was at Google, I always felt like I was playing all of a sudden for the other team, right? I always used to joke that my job was to be a go-between between these two people who were never going to agree and to try to get them to come to some reasonable terms. And so not only inside of Google, you could go eat lunch in the cafeteria and people would say, what are you working on? And you'd tell them, and then they'd kind of say, well, good luck with that. Nobody's ever gotten that through the carriers. In fact, at one point, Steve Jobs, in negotiating with the carriers at Walton Mossberg's digital conference, referred to the carriers as the four orifices, right? And so it was believed after that the iPhone deal with AT&T was one of the carriers felt like it's one of the worst deals that had ever been done because they had given up so much. And so the carriers weren't that receptive to Android in the beginning, and they certainly weren't receptive to Google because they were afraid of Google. They were afraid that Google was going to come in and eat their lunch because we haven't said these two dirty words that everybody was referring to, Steve Jobs and the four orifices, this thing called walled garden, right? The carriers controlled the last mile of the internet. So they owned the mobile internet on a private network, and Google believed that the internet should be free and open. But the carriers had invested $10 billion or more per each network to have that, and they weren't going to give away their family jewels. And so you needed to find some kind of a partnership where somebody would be willing to do that. And Rich and I talked to Rich talked to, and Andy talked to all these carriers in Europe. We were going to launch in the US, and between Rich and I, we talked to every US carrier. And what was really interesting was the thing that saved us in the end was back to open source. Open source was the proof to the carriers that they could, if they didn't like how things ended up, take their own ball and go home because we wouldn't control it. And I remember when we were doing the negotiations, Andy and I with T-Mobile, and I would talk to the business guys, and they'd keep asking me, so what's the catch? And I'd be like, what do you mean? So you say it's open source, but what's the catch? And they wanted to see the legal language. So we showed them the legal language, and they said, is this really it? Why? Because there's no catch, right? They were completely afraid. And so Verizon didn't actually like Google and refused to ever do Android because they had bid on the spectrum and driven up the price in one of the auctions that Verizon paid for spectrum.
Google was competing with Verizon in that.
We had competed with them, and so they didn't like us for that. So they had said, we will not take an Android phone. Sprint was kind of in a Qualcomm bandwagon where they were coming up with their own operating system that was tied to the Qualcomm processor. And so that was carrier number 2 down, right? AT&T was negotiating for the iPhone and ended up landing the contract and actually was very interested in Android, but couldn't convince, I think, the executives inside the company to do both because it was too big to bite off a second one, which left T-Mobile. And we were able to get that deal, but only after they kind of internally evaluated and said no. But then Robert Dotson came back and overrode the decision of his own team to say, this is going to be good because we can do all the things that Android's selling. We can have our own private brand. We can have our own applications across all of our manufacturers. And Robert Dotson was not afraid to compete with Google. He thought that they could use this to distinguish T-Mobile in the very way that we were pitching it.
But we shouldn't also forget, Apple did us a huge favor. Because they did these deals with carriers in every country, basically, where they picked a carrier to do an exclusive deal for a couple of years. As the iPhone started to become successful, the other carriers realized, oh my God, we need something that looks flagship-like that's going to compete with the iPhone. And that's what brought Verizon to the table. Verizon was either going to do a premier BlackBerry device with RIM, or they were going to work with Motorola to do an Android device. And I think, if I recall, I think Andy really didn't want to do a Verizon device. It was CDMA. He didn't want to work with Motorola because Motorola had talked about doing an early device for us and very painful negotiations on that early device, and then they walked away. But in the end, that Motorola Droid device that Verizon launched, and more importantly, the $100 million ad campaign that they committed to with that launch, sort of put Android on the map.
It's what accelerated us and got us ramped up because prior to that, so ever since the iPhone launched, it was the first time that AT&T had closed in on monthly market share. And so up until then, Verizon being the number 1 carrier in the United States for monthly sales was always number 1. And then AT&T launching the iPhone, it reverses it. And they were doing the math and they're going to pass us up. And so they were desperate. It created a vacuum. So they went against the thing they said, we'll never do Android. And like Rich said, not only did they spend $100 million, they went out and licensed Droid from Lucasfilms, and they did a brilliant advertising campaign. And it wasn't Andy Singer, because I thought you were internally choosing where we put our resources because we had so many projects that you were going, this Motorola device is going to steal from the Nexus device we were working on. It's going to steal from Magic and MyTouch that we had to deliver. And so it was a resource allocation issue. And we didn't think we could do all of them. And that was the hesitation. But there was this other thing that was going on inside. There wasn't one person inside Google, including myself. I'd like to say I was a genius and I was the one person who recognized it, but I didn't. The Motorola device, everybody thought it was ugly. Yeah. Everybody thought it would never be successful commercially. They thought it looked too much.
Remember the early devices? The edges were so sharp it hurt your hand
it wasn't rounded. So everybody called it like a geek device. It's the funniest thing. Even the engineers inside Google thought this was an ugly device. And this is an inside story on the marketing, and I'll keep it really short. The CEO of Verizon, having turned this ship almost on a dime to try to compete with the iPhone, needed to create a one-off marketing group to work on the ad campaign. So they went not to their normal agency, but they went to an outside agency and brought them in just for this.
It's very unusual.
And there was this lead creative guy on that team who loved Star Trek. And when everybody else saw this ugly device, this guy saw Star Trek in spades.
Star
and
Wars.
He's the one that came up with the droid idea. They wrote this brilliant campaign, and it was all about making the device cool. And by the time this thing launches, it goes from being an ugly duckling to a princess. The very same device comes out, and with the right marketing and advertising and the droid name, everybody thought this device was somehow cool, and it sold extremely well.
One thing we shouldn't
Let's pause again.
Was it Star Wars or Star Trek?
Star Wars.
I'm sorry. It was Star Trek.
It was Star Trek.
Yeah.
Because that's what you said. So,
Yeah. No, he was a Star
I think
Trek
they're
fan.
interchangeable. It's okay.
Okay.
We licensed it from Lucas, but it was still Star Trek.
Oh yeah, but he was a Star Trek fan.
Right,
though.
right, okay.
Yeah.
And Andy, you were very clear. You wanted to build a platform for developers.
It was from the beginning. I mean, we were, the definition of, developers contributing to a platform and that platform growing bigger and, creating more interest from consumers, that is the ecosystem effect. So it's very, very clear that our goal was to create an ecosystem with this. And I don't think a lot of the industry and certainly a lot of people inside of Google understood that. And even when the iPhone launched, there was
no third-party apps.
No third-party apps. I remember the presentation was, and the way you program it is the browser, right? That was the messaging. And we knew from the beginning that we had an SDK and that we had an affordance for third-party developers. So we did an announcement prior to a launch. And Nick, do you remember when the announcement was?
Yeah, it was in November of 2007, the Open Handset Alliance.
Yep. So we announced the Open Handset Alliance. We laid out kind of what, in broad general terms, we were doing. Didn't talk about any devices or code names or anything like that. And I think the next announcement after the OHA was Android itself, and more details and specs of Android, including the SDK, and that happened in 2008, I think.
Right.
And we announced the Android, the SDK, and the emulator so that people could actually build apps and run them on the emulator.
Yeah. So I think the timing went, iPhone without an SDK, OHA, Android with an SDK, and I think at one point iPhone had to kind of respond to that with an SDK.
And they ran that campaign. There's an app for that, and that was in the first half of 2009.
Yeah.
Yeah, and when we launched the SDK, that's when we wanted to get developers starting to use the platform before there was even a phone, and so we launched the Android Developer Challenge, and we had $1 million or a couple million?
$10 million
worth of awards.
Yeah, so Google put up, and can you imagine the management presentation you have to give when you ask for you're going to give away $10 million as a prize? It was kind of unheard of. But that basically, put the platform on the map for third-party developers, and we created a kind of a little bit of a competitive thrust to the whole thing.
Yeah, because there wasn't a successful phone to incite developers to build apps for, so we just build apps for a prize.
Yeah. I think one of the things you realize, it's we go through kind of the history here. And
people make it more dramatic than it actually was.
I think when you have two centers of innovation, you have what Cupertino was doing with iOS, and you have what Mountain View was doing with Android. And there's only so many ways you can skin the cat. Yes, there's SDKs. Microsoft does SDKs. Apple for Macintosh does SDKs. So it's, Sun Java had SDKs. So bringing an SDK to mobile is not a big deal. They already existed. Bringing an open one with open tools, that had never been done before. So I think there was a lot of community mind share and a lot of community trust in basically making an open development platform, making an open development community. And Rich alluded earlier, there were industry players. Packet video is one of the ones. So we needed video codecs, and there's the quick way to do video codecs, and there's the long way to do it. The long way to do it is you put a bunch of engineers on it, and they implement the spec, and they get it wrong, and they have to go back and fix the bugs, and you finally get a stable video codec, and that takes years. The quick way to do it is you go partner with somebody who already has them, and you convince them to open source their work. Take the proprietary stuff that they've developed over the years and open source it. And that happened a number of times. So we knew that we had mindshare with the community when people basically were coming and open sourcing their company's technology to make it part of Android. Nuance open sourced some speech recognition, Packet video open source, some video codecs, and the list goes on. There was text to speech as well. And the Android team then could could focus on the operating system itself. And Rich and others went and basically accumulated all of the industry stuff necessary. There was a WAP browser, because we're in a transition from WAP to internet. So we needed to have kind of 1 foot in the old way of doing things and 1 foot in the modern way of doing things. So we piecemealed together a solution that was built on top of the operating system. So our 1.0 product was equal or better to everybody else's 3.0 product that had been in the industry for so long. Because remember, Microsoft was still a player here. So that assembly of kind of the coalition of the willing was the OHA. And in the early years, it really had a role in basically guiding the whole development of this thing, because it was 12 years worth of work done in 3.5 years with 90 people, which is just absolutely insane.
There were just a lot of things that planets really aligned. I mean, we helped them align, but they just aligned for us. And there were so many ways that this could have failed or not been successful. First of all, we hadn't got bought by Google, because Google not only gave us the capital so that we could assemble all the software, their name brand, but there were very few companies that would do an acquisition and then give you 4 years before you ship your first product. And it took us 4 years to ship the first phone.
Well, there were some uncomfortable executive meetings I remember that we waded through. I remember Eric Schmidt, who has he's a PhD and a computer scientist and brilliant. And he can ask you a question about how the kernel memory management works, and then talk about his relationship with Lowell McMadam at Verizon and how we got to get a deal done. So extremely broad in his understanding of these things. And I remember sitting across the table from him and him just looking at me, said, "I don't believe you can build an operating system." And then he went and got, and I won't mention any names, but he went and got one of the original Bell Labs Unix guys to come and do a code inspection of Android before it shipped to make sure that it was actually going to be a solid operating system. So we had to answer to all sorts of constituents inside this company. But I would say we had unwavering support from the founders and from the executive team to basically go build this thing, because they could see the future. They know how Google started. They knew what Google was good at, and they knew, that the traction that they had with the consumer was increasing, right? So, and that was all on desktop PCs. So when mobile was first coming online with what the work we were doing, with what Windows was doing, with what iOS was doing with the iPhone, Google could very clearly see that there would be a computer in everybody's pocket. And unless they had a strategy and a solution in that space, they would see their desktop be locked to the desktop while everybody else was operating on billions of things in your pocket. So we had, we were the bet, and we had tremendous support from a bunch of very, very smart people. So back in the day, when we're moving from kind of voice to data applications on cell phones, devices weren't always on. You had to tap a dial button on your handspring device to have it connect to the internet, send and receive emails, and then disconnect. And the carriers had infrastructure to deal with that. They were called GSNs, I think, which was a gateway to the internet over these 2.5G networks. And each box that you would buy, that the carrier would buy to put in their enterprise network, could handle a capacity of a certain number of users. So at Danger, when we built the Sidekick, we built it to be always on, right? So it was always camped on the network. And there are two really almost insurmountable issues with that. The first one is battery life, right? That the battery would die almost instantly if it was always on the network. And that's why all the competitors hit the dial button. And the other one was the carrier had to buy a whole lot of new boxes because the number of people who were on the internet was 1-to-1 for every device that was sold. If you sell 1 million devices, you need enough capacity in your network to handle 1 million always-on connections. And that was expensive. There was a cost to that. We solved the battery life issues. We worked with the carriers on parameters to change and tweaks to make to their network that allowed an always-on device without killing the battery. I mean, just to be clear, always on was, you could receive a notification of an email that arrived instantly. And Nick earlier made reference to Sergey beating me up in one of our first Google meetings. He couldn't believe that we had an always-on device. Because what Google's team had done in the mobile team with their WAP browser and everything else was they used SMS as the channel. And you would send an SMS and like minutes later, it would arrive. And what we demonstrated was a notification happening in an instant messaging conversation where you could basically see the other person typing. Literally, I think, they thought that was a fake demo, but it was the first always-on device. So there had to be a lot of infrastructure built around this idea. And, that hard work had been done, by the folks at Danger and the very talented team there. And we brought that forward to new ideas, new ideas around, notifications are great, instant messaging is great, email is great. What other things could you do with always on? And one of the first examples of that was mapping and navigation, right? People used to have to pay for Garmin or TomTom navigators for their cars. And when Google brought maps to mobile, it basically wiped out the market for in-car navigation because everybody had a screen in their car by default. So an always-on device that could tell you when to take a turn to get to where you need to get to was invaluable at that point, and only Google had it, nobody else had it. So there were several of those types of things that added up to basically a product marketing story that was more powerful than anything the competition had been doing.
Yeah, and I think what surprised me, because I wasn't expecting apps to become so important to the success of smartphones. And initially, the iPhone launched in 2007 with a form factor that's very similar to this. So here we are 12 years later, the form factor hasn't changed at all. And the reason the consumers wanted that device in 2007 was with the touchscreen, we had the first time that somebody could browse the internet and have a good user experience. But with the SDK, and then Apple has the App Store, the iTunes, they add apps, and then Motorola comes out with the Droid and does this advertising campaign, and they start hitting Apple with, oh, you think you're better than Android? And they had this campaign that said, Android multitasks, the Danger Sidekick multitasks. You can't run two apps at the same time, but Droid does. And so all of a sudden, apps were becoming so important to the ecosystem. And if you looked at the ramp rate of the apps, we quickly went from, when we launched Android market,
100.
we had, 100. Right. And then it went to 10,000. And then it went to 100,000. And then it went to 1 billion, right? 10,000 choices is a lot for customers. And this was what ended up being the hockey stick. And it followed the installed user base. And Apple did something that most business people would never do. They ate their own young. So when they launched the iPhone, Steve Jobs chose between launching the iPad or the iPhone. They actually brought it in to show him the iPad, and he said, this user experience is so good, we could do this as a phone. He chose to launch that first, and in doing so, he ate his entire iPod user base. But what that gave him was an incredible run rate for installed user base, which those people then demanded all these apps that started to become popular, and Android was the only platform that was in a position to keep up in that race. That started a foot race. And if you look at the projections, so the G1 launches in October of 2008, right? And in 2010, just 2 years later, Gartner Research is still predicting that the biggest market share will belong to Symbian, right? And that Android and Apple are something like around 14 to 17, it was definitely 20% or less. And so that's where the hockey stick hit. And what happens? By the time we blow through that with the app stores going just nuts, Nokia finally ends up bringing a touchscreen device to market. Microsoft brings a touchscreen to market. They actually have good products, but it's too late. The game is over, and it's not over because they didn't have a good enough device. It's over because they don't have a development community. They don't have millions and millions of subscribers who are demanding apps. So the App Store ended up being the competitive barrier to entry, and it knocks out Nokia and Microsoft in one fell swoop. And the only players that were able to keep in that race was the Android platform.
It was presented to consumers and packaged as open versus closed. And that was part of the Droid Does thing, but it was also part of our strategy. We would, every time we saw, a potential weakness, we'd open something else up new. We would have a developer challenge, or we would make it so, you didn't need to do certain types of verification to get your app in the App Store. We really lowered the barrier to entry for a lot of these things, and that's how it got built up so fast.
Yeah, and as the App Store was ramping up in apps, the other thing that was starting to happen, every year Apple would launch a new iPhone, right? And so one new iPhone a year, because Android was an open platform and every other OEM needed an answer to the iPhone, there were, at any given time, there were hundreds of Android phones being developed and dozens of Android phones being launched, and eventually hundreds and thousands of Android phones being launched every single year. And so you'd go into a carrier and there'd be the iPhone and there would be a whole portfolio of Android devices. And, again, a lot of people don't really realize this, and the percentages in the US are a little bit different, but worldwide Android has over 80% market share. And it's largely because of that choice and the variety of devices. And I sort of remember there was a point in time where there were enough OEMs, each doing their different types of innovation, right? Samsung putting a stylus on the device, or other OEMs focusing on camera, when I realized that there was not a single feature an iPhone was going to be able to launch with that already hadn't been launched on some other OEM's Android device.
It's the benefit of all this openness is that freedom to innovate, and innovation happens all around you. And wouldn't it be a great thing if you could harvest all the innovation and put it in an app store or put it in an ecosystem? And that's what happened with Android.
And that's sort of back to one of the things I think we hoped that would happen is let's not have a Microsoft or an Apple control the platform and not have that level of innovation, but enable lots of other innovation.
Still the same today. And
world peace.
If you think in the world of ecosystems, and you think that ecosystems are a way to get consumers all on the same thing, so the benefit obviously is the sum of the parts is bigger for the consumer experience. You really start thinking about what's the next ecosystem and how do ecosystems emerge. And usually, in my experience, you can't fake an ecosystem. You can't say, I'm going to set out and spend $1 billion to create an ecosystem. That's been tried. Microsoft tries that. A lot of people try that kind of thing. These things either happen by complete accident, or there's some disruption and somebody has a solution that ends up being an ecosystem. So here's an example. Alexa in your home, right? That thing came to market and it was a music speaker, and it was a darn good music speaker. They sold millions of devices to play music in your home with your voice. That's all it did. It had no SDK, no skills. All it did was play music. Once you have a couple of million of those in your home, you turn on the SDK, right? And what that does is that's a signal to third-party developers that says, hey, you guys, there's 1 million people out there with these in their home. You could start selling stuff to them. And developers start saying, wow, that's a good channel, captive audience. I'm going to go create a skill for this and a skill for that, and I'm going to go get in 1 million people's homes like that. And the iPhone was another example of that. When the iPhone first launched, it had no SDK, right? Sold 4 million of them and turned on an SDK, and developers flocked to it. There was 4 million of something for the first time that people were carrying around with them that you could have an icon on, right? So if you think about how ecosystems form, it's usually that way and not by force. And what we talked about a lot today was how the Android ecosystem formed. It formed out of a disruption that happened in the mobile market. So the question, I think, for me is, Android's 12 years old, right? What's the next ecosystem? And what's the disruption that's going to lead to the creation of that ecosystem? And if you pursue it from that aspect and you build technology and you build companies and you found things and you invest in things, chances are you might be in the right place at the right time and be part of that disruption.
Yeah, there's a dark side to what we built that we don't talk much about, which is and it's the one thing about Android and the smartphones that I sort of feel bad at, and that's the amount of time people have phones in front of their faces. And I still don't know exactly what we do about it, but I started working on education in part because I was sort of sad that people use these devices as pacifiers for their kids. You see families at dinner tables out to eat, everybody staring at a device.
Everybody's texting.
Yeah. Or, and it's like you're sitting, two people are sitting together having dinner together, and they're
every now and then they might take a picture of their food.
Exactly.
Instagram it or something.
And so I'm hoping, like my kids revolted against that. They get upset if they see a phone anywhere near the dining table. And I'm hoping that we somehow socially recalibrate against this, because it is an addiction. As we've read the articles, people gamify these apps to get you to want to look at them on screen time. We're finally starting to see capabilities go into the OS to start helping people monitor how much time they're spending in various apps and even set limits to the apps. And so I would like to hope that people, start putting the phones down a little bit and enjoying the conversations they're having with people and smell the roses.
Here.
There's always a gap, a technology gap between what we can imagine and what we can do in the near term. And so you can look at this question in two different ways. In the short term, it's like, what's going to happen next? And that ends up being very incremental. Every now and then you have a big breakthrough where you get a hockey stick, but it oftentimes feels very incremental. 12 years, same form factor. People think this is beautiful. I think that's the same thing we've had for 12 years. That to me is incremental. When I kind of look long term, I am inspired by science fiction, and I think our engineers are inspired by science fiction. And I see, along with Rich's scary version of the future, I sometimes worry what our version will be. I feel like we just went through phase one, which is the Star Trek, where technology has been a productivity tool and a communication tool. I feel like we're heading into the next wave, which is going to be artificial intelligence. And my science fiction reference for that is Wall-E. If you remember, basically artificial intelligence renders human productivity unnecessary, and people sit around in chairs and become fat and diseased, and they're not very happy in their lives. The third phase, I think, just got portrayed very well in Ready Player One, that you now need augmented reality to replace this crappy life that we got after artificial intelligence killed off humans as productive people. And so this, I hate to say it, but sometimes the future seems scary, and I hope that we're smart enough to navigate that we do recalibrate at some point, that people say with the legislation that's probably going to go on with privacy, that we say enough's enough, and maybe we have to move backwards, we have to make things simpler, we have to retrench. I used to have a joke when I left T-Mobile, when I left there to go to Android, my joke to my team was, I'm leaving because I don't want to be here when we implant cell phones in babies' heads. And I sometimes wonder if we're not going to, history's not going to look back and go, these four guys created this platform that helped bring about some of these changes. I hope that humanity is smarter than that.
I do think devices are going to get a lot more humanized. The speech was one of the first, for the history of computers, and mobile phones are just small computers. The way you talk to the computer was using a language the computer could understand. That's why there's ASCII keyboards and 256 characters, and you type because you need to talk to the computer in a language that they understand, and that's how you program computers in a language the computer can understand. Speech is one of the first examples, and speech with an anthropomorphized assistant is one of the first examples where we're starting to turn the devices into something that can understand the person and the person's goals using the language the person's used to, speech. And I think you're going to start to see phones not just do speech recognition and take action, but all these phones have cameras that point at your face, and our faces tell a lot. Where if we're frustrated, if you're using an app and you're frustrated, phone should know you're frustrated. Gesture, right? There's swiping and other things. And so I do think we're going to continue to see the devices, and maybe this means the devices isn't going to have to be in front of our face all the time to do some of our bidding. They're going to start to understand our goals and our intent a little bit better using the natural ways that we communicate. And I think that that's going to be another wave that evolves the user interface of not just mobile phones, but all devices.
Well, let me give my kind of insight in artificial intelligence and where we are today. So I've invested in a number of artificial intelligence companies and technology, and obviously I'm close to what's happening with AI built into operating systems. We're a long way off from this notion of artificial general intelligence. And artificial general intelligence is defined as when you have knowledge in one area and kind of automatically you can transfer that knowledge to another area. Like a child that learns not to spill milk, it takes, I don't know how long, months to figure out there's physics involved, and finally if I do this, it's gonna spill, and if I don't do it right, it's not gonna get to my mouth. But after the child learns, doesn't spill milk as often. The architecture of artificial intelligence is completely different than the way you and I are architected. We have to train each one of our children that same thing over and over again. With AI, once it learns that, all the computers know not to spill milk. So that transference of knowledge today isn't happening between domains, but it's happening at the speed of light between devices. All right, and that's new. That's never been done before. And what we've been talking about a little bit is the dangers of that. What I want to touch on is I'm a technology optimist. I think technology can be used to make the world a better place. Of course, we need to put guardrails on that and make sure that we're all doing our job. But fundamentally, when I code something and when I build something, I do it to make my life better. And I hope that, if it's good for me, it's good for hundreds of millions of people as well. Self-driving cars is a great example of this. Self-driving cars is in everybody's mind these days. They don't work in the snow. They don't work in the rain, right? There's like hundreds and thousands of problems with self-driving cars today. They're probably 10 years off, right? And those don't even require artificial general intelligence. So a lot of the doomsday scenarios, I think there's plenty of time for us to kind of figure our way out as we weave down the road. And in 50 or 100 years, I think we're going to be better off. The three of us individually, before we met, are really into design. Right? Mm-hmm. Like, sometimes in my case, like peculiar design, right? But really into the nuances of creating a world for ourselves and our families in our environment, whether it's a house or a car or a piece of software. I'm not sure if you have three founders that really have, or four founders with Chris, who is a designer. Absolutely. Whether you have a design sense, that inspires a lot of these ideas of what the future is going to look like. Maybe we can explore that a little bit.
Yeah, I'd like to tag onto that, because one of my favorite quotes that I share with young people when I'm mentoring them is that it's from Einstein, and I'm going to paraphrase it, but he basically says, logic can only get you from A to B, but imagination can take you anywhere. And that's, I think, very at the core of what Andy's talking about. And I think one of the things that most people don't understand about the engineering community in whole, and I was the only non-engineer on the founding Android team, but the engineering is for the most part a very creative type of pursuit. The best engineers are extremely creative, and they're painting with code, and the screen and what this device does is their canvas. But it's very creative, and you don't get to that type of thing without that kind of creativity. And I think that's one of the things that I think Andy has always been incredibly great at in building a team, is he's always fostered that, I'll call it the cool factor. There's people always at any point on any team I've worked with, Danger, Android, there's people, engineers running around coming up with something so cool because they want to go show somebody, and Andy's this guy, instead of telling everybody exactly what they should do and have to do, is always looking for that cool thing that bubbles up from that creativity.
One of the things that was interesting in the development of Android, and for me, all the products I think I've ever built have had really strong user interface components. And so while you're doing the development of it, you can be a user of it through that development process way before it's ever launched. And as mentioned, we all have a thing for design. And the great thing about Android is you always need to use a mobile phone. And for, I think, at least a year before we launched the device, we had early versions of the device that we were all using. And we could all sit there and, and I wouldn't even say we got together and had, separate design bashes or sessions. It was a continuous process of us all using the device, things we liked, didn't like, where you would see latency, where you would see an opportunity to maybe do something or innovate. And I think, the first device that we launched benefited from having that cycle throughout its development. One of the great things about Chris, and it really is the sort of unicorn kind of person that you're looking for, is that he was not only a really good designer, but knew how to code. And that's a combination that you just don't often see. And what that really allows somebody to do is not just think about and draw and sketch what they would like to see get implemented and hand that off to somebody else. He could really quickly iterate, the look and feel. And so, before we even had Android as an operating system, he was already starting to iterate look and feel and interactions with just sort of Linux and Flash and some other core capabilities. So to me, that was sort of my first impression of him and his ability to contribute to the team.
And that talent, that ability to basically envision a design in your head and then express it in code is kind of what Nick was talking about with the artist and the canvas. Chris was that guy, is that guy. And for us, when you combine that talent with new technology, a capacitive touchscreen, that exploration of what can you do with a capacitive touchscreen? Yeah, I can do like button presses, but when do I get to flick the earth and watch and see what happens when you create a virtual physical world inside the device? It's another avenue that the artists can express themselves. And that's all Chris. He was the guy that basically made that all happen.
We said before how important Google was to Android. In my experience, the even more important thing inside of Google was Larry Page and how he believed in us from day one, from that first meeting, and his commitment and his vision of what Android could become, I think most of the time exceeded our own. Yeah. He believes in moonshots. He walked the talk, and I just felt like we could never have chosen a better partner than Google. And I believe that at the core of that was Larry Page's commitment to our project.
Yeah.
Totally agree.
Yeah, Larry saw that mobile phones were just going to be mobile computers in everybody's pocket, I think, before we even saw that, right? We were thinking, we came from the carrier space, smartphone features, capabilities, and he leapt immediately to, that's the future computer, it's wireless, it can go anywhere, it's in your pocket.
And I think the other thing that he did that was really unique was he built infrastructure at Google to allow this type of thing to develop. The interaction that we're having today and the experimentation and the trial and error, a lot of errors along the way, but also kernels of really, really good ideas that get embraced. Google, in the early days in this time frame, was infrastructure for that, and it worked really, really well.